Hi everyone! Welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing my July wrap-up and we are doing an upcoming TBR, and I am going to be changing up the way I do wrap-ups and TBRs moving forward on the channel because I've noticed that when I make myself do a monthly TBR and a monthly wrap-up, I feel like I always have too much to talk about at the end of the month where I can't really take my time, or I kind of dread filming these huge monthly wrap-ups. And I also kind of just feel a lot of pressure on myself to like finish everything by the end of that month, and if I don't get to it by the end of that month, then I've failed in some way, which is really silly. Why do we feel that way? So how I'm going to be doing wrap-ups and TBRs in the future is just every time I have 4 or 5 books to talk about, I'm gonna come on here and do a wrap-up for you all, and then talk about the next 4 to 5 books I want to read. Instead of making it monthly, we're just gonna make it whenever it happens. So that way I'm talking about less books in these wrap-ups and can take my time more with talking about them, and I'm not putting this pressure on myself to like finish all these things in this one month or else you failed. So that's gonna be better for me, I think, personally. And I used to do this like last year on the channel, a year before sometime, and I really liked it, and I don't know why I moved away from that, so I'm gonna move back to that. I liked that way of doing things. So this will be my last monthly wrap-up, and the TBR will not be an August TBR, it will just be the next 4 or 5 books I'm planning on picking up. So let's start with talking about all the books that I did manage to read in the month of July. And if you didn't know, for my Patreon, I was hosting a themed readathon for the month of July called the 5-Star Treasure Hunt Readathon. And the goal of the readathon was to find 5-star books. And I am happy to report that I found a 5-star book. I did not find multiple, unfortunately, but I did find one 5-star book that I'm very excited to chat about. So I'm going to go, as always, in the order of my enjoyment, but I do have a series on here, so I'm just going to talk about the series as a whole. So let's start with my 2 3-star books that I had, and my least favorite book of the month. I'm not going to say too much about it because I haven't actually had the live show with my patrons yet, talking about all of our thoughts, since this was our book club pick for last month. I don't know why I've been striking out so much on our book club picks for my Patreon. I feel so bad. But that was The Pariah by Anthony Ryan. It's not that I dislike this book, I just found it okay for me. This follows a character named Alwyn who is basically telling you his story from an unknown future point of time, where he's kind of reflecting back on his life story and sharing with you how he got to where presumably he is today as he's writing his story. And we start off in this story where he is very much a part of this group of outcasts, where this outcast king is trying to overthrow this like duke, and the main character ends up getting pulled in several different directions in this book, and it's ultimately about him surviving each of these different situations that he finds himself in and how he manages to move on to the next situation. So it's kind of not a very streamlined plot. It's very much just following this character as you're going through his life, and I'm finding out that that's something that just isn't my favorite thing in fantasy to read about. I had the same problem with Empire of Silence by Christopher Rocchia, which I know is more sci-fi, but that's sci-fantasy. So I think that kind of story, while I can see why it would appeal to certain readers, I don't know that that's just my favorite type of story to follow. So this one, it was okay. There were moments that I really liked, and I won't say too much more because I don't want to spoil everything for that live show, but I do find that overall this one was a little bit of a slog to read, and I probably won't be continuing on with the series, but there were moments that I really enjoyed, so it was kind of a mixed bag. The other 3-star read I had was The Judas Blossom by Stephen Aryan. This is one that was just published last month, and it's this author's newest release, and I was really excited about it. It is more of a historical fantasy, very light on the fantastical elements, hardly any real magic in this story at all. And so you're kind of following this historical time period around the Mongolian Empire, and it's infused with a lot of Persian culture, and it was a really interesting point of time for this fantasy book to take place. I had never read anything kind of in this time frame inspired by these particular events and this particular war and everything. So it was really interesting reading about this and learning more about this time period. However, for me, it was just the characters really weren't connecting with me. You follow a couple different perspectives. To give this book credit, I think all three of the perspectives that we follow, at least the main perspectives, were quite interesting. There wasn't one that I was like, oh gosh, we have to go back to this one now. All three of them were pretty interesting, so it wasn't that, but they never really, like, as the characters went on, they never really connected with me. I did find some of the dialogue a little bit like unrealistic, a little stilted, maybe too melodramatic at some points. It felt kind of unrealistic at times. So for me, I was expecting this to be a lot more like political and centered more around like military strategy, and it just wasn't as much of that as I was expecting it to be. So I liked the culture, I liked the time period we were in. It was just the characters really weren't doing a whole lot for me. So that was kind of my issue with the Judas Blossom, but this is one that maybe I will continue on with this series, depending on how reviews are of the sequel that comes out, because I am intrigued enough to see maybe where this goes if that sequel does get some good reviews. So that one was another 3-star, but a little bit more on the positive side than the Pariah. So now moving to a 4-star, I have They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. This is one I listened to on audiobook, and I really enjoyed this. I had just a really good time with it. I thought it was just a fun time. This is one where you're following a character who is a teacher at this private school, and basically she goes around and, kind of like Dexter, she kills men in her community that have reported like sexual abuse or harassment and go unpunished, and she kind of finds them and takes justice into her own hands. So she's kind of like Dexter in that way, where she definitely has this urge to kill, but she tries to direct that to people she believes deserve it. So your mileage will vary with this one, but for me, I just had a good time with it. It's not a thriller in regards to having like big twists or anything. You are kind of clued in on what's going on the whole time in this story, so there isn't any big shocking moments or anything like that, but it's just kind of a thriller in the sense that there's always some sort of mystery or action going on to propel the story forward, and it has quite a quick pace. So I really liked it for that reason. I just couldn't put it down when I was listening to it. I was really excited to get back to it. So is it one of my all-time favorites? No, but I did have a really good time with it. All right, I'm going to talk about the next 4 books altogether because they are part of a series that I reread, and that is Mistborn Era 2. I have not yet finished this out with The Lost Metal, but I did manage to reread all 3 of the books leading up to that one, and I also read for the first time Mistborn Secret History. So this series I read for the first time probably about 5 years ago? No, it can't be that long. 4 years ago. And at the time, I gave every book in this series 3 stars. And upon reread, I actually appreciated and enjoyed this series so much more. So I ended up giving The Alloy of Law 4 stars, I gave Shadows of Self 4.5 stars, and I gave The Bands of Mourning 4 stars, and then I also gave Mistborn Secret History 4 stars. So I enjoyed this so much more. I reread it via audio, so I listened to the audiobook this time, and I was really worried about that because usually I can't listen to fantasy books on audio, but I think because it was a reread, because I was already so familiar with the places and the characters and all the names, it totally clicked with me, and I really liked Michael Kramer's narration, so it was very easy to reread it via audio for me, and I really enjoyed it. I appreciated the characters so much more this time around. I remember really liking Steris from my first read, but I didn't really remember loving like any of the other characters, but I really loved Wax. I loved Wayne. I loved Marcy this time so much more upon this second read. And then the actual plots. Alloy of Law, even though this one starts what feels much, much lower stakes, especially coming fresh off of Mistborn Era 1 and going into Alloy of Law, it feels like the stakes are so low compared to what you get in Hero of Ages. But knowing where the series goes, I was able to see kind of what Sanderson was planting and what he was kind of laying the foundation for. And so I ended up really loving how he hinted at what's to come in a really subtle way with this one. So you start with like very low stakes, but then, as always with Sanderson books, you have endings that really leave you very intrigued. And Shadows of Self, this one's my favorite in Era 2 so far because I loved all of the connections to Era 1 so much. And there was so much to just like dig your teeth into and figure out and puzzle out in this one. And then Bands of Mourning was really good too. The stakes are definitely upped. So I really had so much more fun with this time around. I love the setting so much more. I think just the first time having read this right after Mistborn Era 1 and it having such a different tone and setting and coming off of Hero of Ages, which was like one of my favorites at the time, I was just kind of let down a little bit. But now having the like hindsight and knowing where it goes, I just appreciated it more. So I loved my reread of this, and now I feel very prepared for The Lost Metal. But let's talk about Mistborn Secret History really quick, because this was my first time reading it. I can't believe it was my first time reading it. And I know a lot of folks have differing opinions on when to read Mistborn Secret History. I've seen some people talk about reading it after you finish Hero of Ages. I've seen some people talk about after you finish Shadows of Self, reading Secret History, and then after Bands of Mourning. Other people think you should wait until Bands of Mourning is done. So where do I think? I read it before I reread Bands of Mourning because that's, my husband had said that was his reading preference, what he thought was a good idea. And I can see why people would say that, but I actually kind of think I would have preferred reading it right after I had finished Era 1. I think some of the stuff in Secret History doesn't hit quite as hard if you're really far removed from Era 1 like I am. I mean, it's been 5 years since I've read Era 1. So some of it is a little foggy on the details, and this is one that I think would benefit a lot from reading it pretty close to when you finish Era 1. I was personally spoiled by another booktuber talking about Mistborn Secret History. I was spoiled for what's in this book, so I'm going to tell you absolutely nothing about it. All I'm going to tell you is that it's in the world of Mistborn, obviously, and that you should look into reading orders yourself to kind of see, you know, based on what kind of reader you are, maybe there's a certain time you would rather read it, but I personally recommend reading it right after you finish Era 1 and right before you get into Era 2. I think that that's when you can kind of appreciate it the most, but I can also see why people say to wait until like halfway through or all the way through Era 2. It was originally published after Bands of Mourning, so the people who were reading Mistborn as it came out didn't even have this accessible to them until after they had already read Bands of Mourning. So I think Sanderson originally was using Secret History to maybe explain some things. That's my understanding. So anyways, all that to say, Secret History, I feel like, is required reading, especially if you're a Cosmere fan. This is what no one told me about Secret History. I knew it was important to Mistborn. I didn't realize how important it was to the greater Cosmere, and that's what was so surprising to me, and that's what I enjoyed so much about Secret History. There is so much Cosmere stuff in this, and if you are a Cosmere fan, please go read Secret History. It is great for that. I think, again, just because I'm so far removed from Era 1, maybe some of the things didn't hit as hard as they could have if I had read it a little bit closer to that. So that is Secret History, and that is Era 2. I'm very excited for Lost Metal now. And then finally, the last book that I read and my favorite book that I read is Nolan by Michael J. Sullivan. I actually just finished this morning, the day I'm filming this. So I am like on such a high still from reading this book. I loved it so much. 5 stars. At first, I wasn't sure if it was going to get 5 stars from me because the first half of this book actually just feels kind of like a highlight reel of Legends of the First Empire. I think that Legends of the First Empire is required reading before you read Nolan. I know that Michael J. Sullivan writes these books so that you can read them in any order, and I can see how you could start with Nolan without having read anything else, but I think it would be a huge disservice to the reader if you start with Nolan before reading Legends of the First Empire. First of all, it spoils a ton of what happens in Legends of the First Empire, so if you want to be pleasantly surprised by some of the stuff in that book or in that series, definitely don't read this first. And second, it has so many connections to Legends. Like, it's so interconnected with very specific references to characters, events, everything. So it's really, really essential, I think, to have a full, complete reading experience to read Legends of the First Empire first. Now, that being said, I think the second half of this book, it finally found its own footing and became its own story, and the characters finally kind of stopped referencing and catching up the reader on like everything that had happened in Legends and finally became like their own characters with their own stories. And so it finally had that forward momentum instead of constantly reflecting on the past and talking about past events. It finally had that forward momentum in the second half and became its own thing. And that's when it really shined. I loved like the last 100 pages of this book. I could not put down. It was so fantastic. So I think that for anyone who is a fan of the world of Elon, if you're a fan of Legends of the First Empire, Nolan is an amazing addition to that series, and it takes place about 800 years after the events of Legends of the First Empire. So I don't want to say too much. I mean, you know from the title what character might be in this book, but I really don't want to say too much about it because I want you to go in not knowing much because I don't want to spoil anything from Legends of the First Empire. So fantastic reading experience. Once again, Michael J. Sullivan knocks it out of the park, creating characters that I just fall in love with. Even in one book, I was already so connected to some of these new characters that we had been introduced to, and the references to Legends and some of the things that now have transpired since those events just made me like quite emotional, quite reflective, like, oh my goodness, I just care so much about the characters from that series that I cared so much about what happened in this series, at least this one book. I'm sad that I don't get any more of this particular time frame. I know we now jump ahead again to the next event that takes place in the book Fairlane, which is the second standalone in this Rise and Fall trilogy. So I'm very excited to continue on, but I'm going to miss these characters and these events, and I just love Michael J. Sullivan's world and his characters so much. Also, there were some really good like twists and surprises in this one that I wasn't expecting. So that is everything that I read in the month of July. Now let's talk about what I'm going to be reading next. And Technically, I have 6 books for you. The first is The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson, but I'm already like halfway through this book. It's only 100 pages long, so I feel like I'm going to finish this probably like today or tomorrow. That is going to be the next book that I feature in my next wrap-up, but it's almost done, so I'm going to feature 5 more books. Usually it'll only be 5 books I feature at a time. So Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson, that's the first book that I'm already halfway through, and I can already tell I'm really going to enjoy it. I know that this is a lot of people's favorite Sanderson. I don't know if it's that good for me yet. I'm kind of still waiting to see. Maybe I'm still a little too early into it to really see. But I love the magic. It's super unique and different, and I really like the part of the world that we're in. I think the culture and the setting is really cool and different for a Sanderson book, so I'm really enjoying Emperor's Soul so far, and I really like our main character, really like her. So more to come in my next wrap up on this one. The next book I have is, once I finish Emperor's Soul, I'm jumping into Arm of the Sphinx by Josiah Bancroft, because we are doing a buddy read of this in my Patreon, and it's because we all read Sun and Sons together a couple months ago, and some of us were like a little bit more mid on that book. Some really liked it, some were like meh. But we all decided to kind of continue on because we were very intrigued, and we had a really interesting discussion in our live show. And I originally wasn't going to continue on with this series until I talked to my patrons about it. And now I'm intrigued enough to continue. So this is one that I want to check out sooner rather than later, just to see if this series really is going to be for me. This is kind of the make or break book, whether or not I continue on with the Books of Babel series. So I'm very curious. I hope that I really enjoy this one, and if I'm not, then I'm just gonna put it aside and accept that it's not for me, but I think it'll be at least, hopefully, interesting conversations that it starts. So that will be the next book I read physically after finishing Emperor's Soul. And then I also have an audiobook right now that I'm listening to. I just started it. It's Big Lies in a Small Town by Diane Chamberlain. This author I've read from before. I read The Dream Daughter, and I loved that book so much. I loved that book. So I wanted to check something else out by this author, and this I had found at a local used bookstore. Grabbed it really without knowing much about it. I really don't know what this is about. So I'm very curious to check it out and see if maybe this author could potentially become a favorite author, because I loved The Dream Daughter so much. So that was the reason I picked this one up. We'll see how I end up enjoying that one. And then the next physical book I will read is going to be The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. I've heard that I should probably read Emperor's Soul first before diving into The Lost Metal, because there's some Cosmere implications potentially. So I've heard The Lost Metal is just Avengers Endgame crossover event for the Cosmere. I'm very hopeful that I'm going to love it. My reread of Era 2 has gone very well, so here's to hoping. I love the conclusion of Era 2. I have high hopes. I'm also going to finish out another series, hopefully, because my next physical read will be this chunker, Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. This is humongous. How many pages is this? This is 750 pages. Help, send help. Yeah, this might take a while, but I really want to finish out this series. I've heard a lot of people say this is the best in the trilogy, and I've really enjoyed the trilogy so far. I gave the first two books 4 stars. I really like the characters. I really like the world. We'll see what happens. I feel like the second book ended in like such an insane place that I just have to know where it's all going. So I'm very hopeful that I like this. If I don't, I'm in for it, because this is quite a long book to read if I don't like it. I would obviously not finish it if I wasn't liking it, but I hope I like it. I hope I can get through it pretty quickly, and that it's like a page turner kind of book. We'll see. And then finally, the last book that I want to put on this upcoming TBR is going to be one of my patron picks. So if you didn't know, if you're in the top tier of my patrons, you get to suggest a book for me to put on my TBR each month. And this month, I am going to make sure to include that book right at the beginning of the month to make sure I get to it. I do still have the book that was previously picked for me. I had started that one, The Helm of Midnight by Marina Losetter. I'd started this one and then had to put it aside for a book club book, and I just have not had a chance to pick it back up. I know I could probably pick it up soon, but I kind of want to restart it like entirely, because I was like halfway through when I had to put it aside, and I kind of like don't remember some of the stuff, and I like was not in a good headspace, like was not in a great like fantasy mood when I was reading it. I don't know. I need to restart it. So I want to put a little bit of distance of time between me and that book before I actually like go back and restart it from the very beginning. So that one will eventually be finished and will eventually be on another TBR, but I'm gonna go ahead and pick another patron pick in the meantime to kind of start fresh. I'm going to roll the dice and randomize it and see which of their picks ends up getting selected. So cue the dice. And I am excited about this one because I actually already owned it. So that is going to be The Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu. So this is one that I recently saw the trailer for the adaptation come out, and the trailer looked absolutely incredible. And I have heard that this is some people's like one of their favorites of all time, one of their favorite sci-fi books. I've heard it's somewhat confusing, but still like readable. I don't know. A little bit complex, a little bit more of like hard sci-fi concepts potentially. So I really don't know what to expect from this one. I'm a little bit nervous about it, but I hope I really enjoy it. I've owned it for a while now, so I'm glad I finally have this push to get to it. So that is my upcoming TBR. That is my July wrap-up. Did you see any books that I featured that you have any thoughts on? Leave those comments down below. And what was your favorite book that you read in the month of July? I would love to know, so leave those comments down below as well. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye!